Thanks again for joining today. This is the second of our new flexible learning course on vaccine misinformation. Today, we are going to talk about common vaccine narratives that are vulnerable to misinformation and data deficits and how to identify them. If you're not familiar with us, we are First Draft. We are a global organization working to empower people with knowledge and tools to build resilience against harmful, false, and misleading information. Just to introduce myself, my name is Marie Bonner. I'm Global Head of Partnerships at First Draft. I'm working on collaborations and outreach within the organization and outside, so do not hesitate to get in touch with me after this course if you want to explore any possibilities of partnerships or collaborations. I'm also French and German, so pardon my English. Today, we are going to talk about three main things. First of all, common vaccine narratives that we have seen online in our research published in November 2020, but which was worked on last summer. Then we are going to look at data deficits. In other words, topics related to vaccine where there is an undersupply of information. And then we are going to talk about oversupply of information and what that can create. The report Under the Surface, COVID-19 Vaccine Narratives, Misinformation and Data Deficits on Social Media was published by First Draft in November 2020. This new piece of research has identified key vaccine narratives on social media platforms in English, French, and Spanish, which could erode public trust in a COVID-19 vaccine and vaccines more generally. The research was conducted last summer, as I mentioned, by First Draft, among growing concerns that dangerous narratives and conspiracy theories may result in increasing vaccine skepticism. The authors are Dr. Claire Waddle, Rory Smith, and Seb Cubban. They analyzed 1,200 related posts with the intention to identify dominant narratives, as this is a way to understand how the vaccine discourse on social media is being framed and how it can be weaponized for mis- and disinformation. First Draft created a unique vaccine typology, which we use to categorize social media posts in English, French, and Spanish. The research we conducted was about vaccine narratives in general, positive, negative, true, untrue. That's not the matter. It's just what were the dominant conversations. But the multiplicity of narratives has contributed to an environment of uncertainty. Now, there are noticeable differences from one language to another in terms of themes around vaccines. Here are the 6 narrative buckets that we found vaccine misinformation was falling into. So we have political and economic motives, safety, efficacy and necessity, development, provision and access to the vaccine, conspiracy theories, liberty and freedom, and morality and religion. In this first section, we are going to dive into these narratives and share some examples with you. Before we are diving into these narratives, I want you to have the 3 following questions in mind. The first one is, how does it help me to understand the concerns that people have about vaccines? If you joined our last session, we talked a little about the different languages that we explored in our research, and for example, about the fact that the narratives around morality and religion were much more frequent in Spanish, whereas the liberty and freedom narrative was important in English-speaking conversation, but non-existent in Spanish chatter. It means that you need to keep in mind what could apply or not to your language, community, or country. The next question that I would like you to keep in mind is, what kind of information would help to address the concerns that people have? That is like to be thinking in terms of solutions. What kind of information do I need to put out to address these concerns? The third question to keep in mind while navigating these narratives and example is, what are some keywords I could use to research this topic further? That means paying attention to language in your research and in your monitoring more generally. If you were there for our last session, you know that there are two main buckets of narratives that were particularly dominant across all languages in our research. Political and economic motives was the first and most dominant narrative. Here are a couple of examples of narratives that fall into this category. For example, the first one, concentrated financial interests drive vaccine development and undermine its safety. The second one being, leaders are promoting vaccines for political gains. Now, if you look at these narratives and at the last one, if you think about keywords that you could use around media and pharmaceutical companies, for example, the keyword big pharma would definitely something to be looked at. The general theme that ties these together is mistrust of politicians and institutions and mistrust regarding the influence of money. The second and most important narrative bucket across languages is safety, efficacy, and necessity of the vaccine. Now, if you look at this first one, we did try not to only categorize negative narratives. So this first narrative, the COVID-19 vaccine is a ticket back to normality, could be seen as the silver bullet narrative. Even though the silver bullet narrative trusts the idea of vaccines and the use of vaccines, it is setting up unrealistic expectations. So when the vaccine isn't the magical solution that it was promised to be, that can easily be then weaponized and turned into disinformation. We also saw a lot of misinformation around vaccines coming from communities of alternative wellness, leading to narratives, as we can see for the second one, a healthy immune system is more powerful than a vaccine. But of course, these narratives can also be very much linked to skepticism towards pharmaceutical companies, as well as concerns about the ingredients of the vaccines. And the last one we saw a lot is interesting, acknowledging that if you already poison your body with drugs and alcohol, of course you can take the vaccine. It is weirdly inciting people to take the vaccine, but it also categorizes the vaccine itself among poisons. Although the first two narrative buckets are the prominent ones, the rest of it is not in a particular order. This third one is in fact one of the less found in our research, meaning still among dominant narratives in social media by the time the research was done. It is related to the question of development, provision, and access to the vaccine. You can see that the first narrative is related to the Russian vaccine, Sputnik 5 or Sputnik V. I want to underline that it's not because this narrative is there that it does express any judgment about the quality or the efficiency of this vaccine, nor about the fact that it was the first vaccine to be found or not. As a matter of fact, the Sputnik vaccine has had some very positive reviews recently. So if we mention this narrative here, it is because it has been prevalent conversation on social media last summer and had a vulnerability to misinformation. A lot of other vaccines have been discussed in the same way in the meantime, and that's also something to keep in mind. The second narrative here is that the provision of the vaccine around the world is inequitable. It is true that provision is not available in the same way in every country for a variety of reasons, but it is still interesting to think about how this narrative might be weaponized for mis and disinformation. You might have people saying, for example, well, if you need the whole world to be vaccinated and you know that this is never going to happen, then what's the point of vaccination anyway? Another bucket of narratives we found is the one gathering conspiracy theories, and this one has been particularly strong in French-speaking conversations. There are two examples here of the conspiracy theories we saw. The one that we saw a lot is that vaccines will allow bad actors, most of the time mysterious elites, to microchip and control entire populations. Another one is that vaccines are a tool for depopulation programs. As I said in our last session, the figure of Bill Gates is very often associated with these theories and to such a variety of conspiracy theories that it seems that adding Bill Gates to them almost acts as a credibility asset for the theory itself. Conspiracy theories also often feed off the idea of the elite or of the rich wanting to control or eradicate the people or the poor. This next bucket of narratives is liberty and freedom. This category was particularly popular in English-speaking social media. Popular narratives vary a lot from one country or one language to another, as well as they vary in time. And this is something to take into account, especially when monitoring narratives in your own country or your own language. As a reminder, I said it before, but these are the results of a research that we did last summer, and a lot has been happening since. An example of this bucket is the first one. It starts with a mask, moves to vaccines, and ends in total control. We have seen a lot of this in the United States of America, boosted by anti-lockdown, anti-mask, and anti-quarantine sentiments, all sort of joining forces in a general anti-vaccine sentiment. This goes hand in hand with the narratives that politicians are finding more and more ways to control and submit the population. Now, this bucket of narratives, as I mentioned before, was particularly popular in Spanish-speaking conversations. The first example we see, for example, is the blood of Christ is the only vaccine against COVID-19. We saw a lot of these religion-themed narratives around the COVID-19 vaccine and its creation, especially in the LATAM region. You can see that the second one goes in the same direction. It is linking religion to science in the quest for answers to the crisis of the pandemic. This section probably felt like a lot. I'm sorry for that, because we did navigate through these 6 narratives, but we had 2 goals to do so. The first one is to be better communicators. What do we mean by that? As we learned in our last session, when we are talking about vaccine trust, misinformation isn't the whole picture. So if you want to get quality information out there, or if you want to counter misinformation narratives, you have to understand what the legitimate questions or concerns from the public are, what they are talking about. I also mentioned on this slide that we want to be better researchers. So we are going to talk more about it in the next session. I hope you will join us for it, because it's about keywords and search queries and how to strategize your searches. One of the main aspects of research when working on information is to pay attention to language. The language people are using actually when they are talking about these themes in social media conversations, which might be very different from your own words to describe the same themes. Let us now dive into the next part of our session and explore the concept of data deficits. Data deficit is a concept my colleagues did put together when they did their research. It is what happens when there isn't enough credible information to meet demand. Here are some examples looking at the theme of the COVID-19 vaccine. It is where we don't have enough information in relation to areas the audience are interested in. So the first one, for example, is when mRNA technology and DNA alterations are 2 areas where people have a lot of questions and concerns. And there isn't a lot of in-depth reporting on these matters. We then have the topic of GMOs and aluminum. Aluminium salts have been used as ingredients in vaccines for a while. And people have a lot of concerns, as I said before, about vaccine ingredients. And again, there is not a lot of reporting about it. And finally, people have a lot of concerns as well, and sometimes very valid ones, about the legal impunity for pharmaceutical companies and about pharmaceutical companies in general. Now, this graph shows you how data deficits emerge and how they are then exploited. Let me just do this. Thank you. So the first step is that a novel or previously niche issue surfaces. The second step is that people have a number of legitimate questions, but the information provided is often misleading, confusing, false, or even harmful. Then, third step, a deficit emerges. Then, 4, malicious actors exploit the deficit by spreading false or misleading claims. 5, these messages are then laundered through the information ecosystem thanks to a variety of manipulation and dissemination tactics. And 6, the messages amplify attitude-shaping narratives. And that is specifically the problem, is that it conducts 2 changes in attitude. Now, if you are trying to counter emerging data deficits, there are 2 things you need to do. The first step is to understand how data deficits can be exploited. This is relevant for vaccine, mis and disinformation, but for other topics as well. So first of all, misleading information can easily be duplicated and translated into various languages. We have seen, for example, networks of legitimate looking blogs writing and translating and publishing the same content. The proliferation and amplification of it makes it all look legitimate. Another thing we see as well is that information will be slightly modified to obfuscate the source and reduce its traceability. As we saw before, misinformation has strong roots when associated with a kernel of truth. So actors of disinformation can take information and twist it out of its context. They can then easily adapt it to the message they want to fuel while building on some sort of credibility. A very effective way to use data deficits for disinformation actors is also to spread the message they want across multiple platforms, as this also reinforces the legitimacy of the claim. If it's there on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Telegram, then it must be true because there is this proliferation of information. This is where our second step comes into play. Know how to spot a data deficit, that is the lack of information, even before the audience wants to look for it. Here are a number of key indicators to keep in mind. Often, topics that can be spotted as data deficits are done so because they are new, which means that there isn't a lot of information and coverage available anyway. False or misleading information can thus easily chime in and fill the gaps. Other topics that can end up as being data deficits are technically complex ones. This is something we have seen generally with COVID-19 and science reporting. Studies, for example, are very difficult to report on in a way that is readable for a general audience and also not too simplistic or reductive. Another sign is when a topic really aligns with pre-existing narratives. So we just went through 6 of the main vaccine-related narratives that we have seen last summer. If a narrative really does fit well with one of these buckets, for example, a narrative built on vaccines and religion, or a potential safety issue of the vaccine, you know that there is an excellent grazing ground there for misinformation in some of the languages. Also, is the narrative you are looking at politically significant? We saw from our research that political and economic motives is the dominant bucket for narratives across the 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French. We also saw from the last session that people in general might have a lack of trust for politicians and institutions, that they would trust their personal doctor more than governmental authorities. Now, another sign to pay attention to is if the content you are looking at is emotionally charged. Misinformation often plays to people's emotions, and this specific factor is also responsible for a lot of sharing of posts and social media. And last but not least, a data deficit might also just build on an area of legitimate questioning with lack of reliable coverage. Now we are going to cover 3 simple tips you can use to figure out data deficits. Here is the first practical tip. Do a search on Google or YouTube on a particular topic and take note of the results. Fill gaps where quality information is lacking. So here you can see a little research with the term vaccine injury on YouTube that was done by my colleague Shay Urbani. The results show up that these reports are all basically anecdotes on vaccine injuries. Some of them are positive about vaccines, some of them are not. But what they have in common is that they don't really put the side effects of vaccines into perspective. But perspective is specifically what people are needing. It is one thing to say this person had the vaccine and had an allergic reaction, but it is another to give the actual context for that. What did the trial about it say? How likely are you to have the same similar reaction? Typing terms like that in search engines can help you understand where the gaps are in accurate and reliable information. The second practical tip is to reinforce your social media presence. There is a lot of discourse on vaccines on social media. Whatever your role is as a journalist, as a researcher, it might be interesting to develop your presence online to interact with the people that are already having these conversations or might want to join them. One thing that you could do, for example, is to create an AMA for Ask Me Anything on Reddit. If you go to the Reddit website, they have a whole, as you can see on the slide, they have a whole media and partnerships toolkit where they can help you to get ready and they can give you some tips about how to engage with your audience. Of course, the kind of platform you might want to use for this depends on where your audience is based. Sometimes Reddit might not be the most appropriate because it's less popular than Facebook, which also can be a good option. You also have to take into account the protocols of your organization in terms of reaching out and interacting with external audiences while staying safe. This is also something we will take we will talk more about, in a later session. Our last tip is avoid asking open-ended questions on social media. If you do, have a moderator ready to offer fact checks in the comments. So why is that? Well, as you can see in these 3 examples, 2 of them are open-ended questions. And the reason we recommend not to pose these headlines as open-ended questions is because very often the comments to these kind of posts are filled with misinformation. We are now coming to the last section of this session, and we are going to talk about oversupply of information. So what is oversupply? It is when sheer quantity of information leads to confusion and news avoidance. There are some examples of what we have too much information of. First of all, there has been a lot of reporting on the race of the development of vaccines, but not enough contextual reporting to help people make sense of it. If we get back to the study around the dengue vaccine controversy in the Philippines that we saw in the last session, there was a proliferation of media coverage about the protracted Senate investigation about the vaccine, but it was focusing much more on corruption allegations than on the actual safety of the vaccine. We also realized recently how there was humongous coverage of the press releases of pharmaceutical companies, sometimes with no critical point of view at all. We also saw that some people have big concerns about pharmaceutical companies in general when it comes to vaccines. So that might not inspire a lot of confidence in the quality of the reporting itself. And this is really something to think about. So this is the end of today's session around vaccine narratives and data deficits. Next time will be a very practical session, a very hands-on session to dive into keywords and search strings, a session to learn on how to search the web in a strategic way to enhance your research and your reporting. This next session in this time frame will be facilitated by my tremendous colleague, Laura Garcia, First Drafts Training Manager. Here you have the dates and the languages for the next two sessions. So we also have been developing a bunch of resources that are specifically about vaccine misinformation. On our hub, you will find updated vaccine narratives from around the world, search tips for monitoring disinformation, curated Google Trends, Twitter lists, etc. You can also go there for our registration link to sign up for our other flexible learning courses and also for our Vaccine Insights newsletter.